Welcome to Withdraw Consent. I'm Jack. Today we're joined with Gerron for the second episode in his ancient medieval Jewish kingdoms, and we're going to talk about Khazars, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, so you remember on our last episode we talked about the Himyarite kingdom and how that lasted up until the early 500s, early 6th century, and then we kind of ended on the rise of Islam. Now, a lot of you on this show, I'm sure, have heard of the Khazars and the Khazar Khaganate, and how it was a example of a medieval Jewish empire, one of the only ones that didn't only exist, but it was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world at the time. Now, you remember also we talked about how a lot of the Jews went over to the Sassanid Persian Empire in the around a little bit before the rise of Islam. So we have these two superpowers at the time, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And they've been locked in a Cold War with each other for really going back to ancient Rome. They've been almost like natural eternal enemies and rivals. So fast forward to 640, the period between 620, 628, that period, there's a massive war between the Byzantines and the Sassanids, which really weakened the Sassanids. 640 and the years leading up to around 700, the Rashidun Caliphate, a lot of which had these Himyarite and Yemeni groups in them. They ran through the Sassanid Empire and essentially took over. No, that was the end of the Persian Empire for the time being. Now, while that's happening, up in the north, you have the Göktürk kingdom. These are these ancient proto-Turks. Now, the Göktürks spread from basically Europe all the way to China. The Chinese Tang dynasty famously fought against them as well. It was massive. Now, this empire falls around the same time, and there's this new group that rises up, and these are the Khazars. Now, the Khazars are a Turkic people, and it's interesting because I don't think you ever mentioned it on the show, but there are verses in the Talmud which specifically classify groups of people according to their race. So at the top, obviously, you have the Jews, and then beneath them you have just other people, and you have Turks there. And there's actually verses that say, like, you can, if you have to do a favor for someone, you should do it for a Turk and not for a Roman, or especially not a Christian. I don't have the exact verse, but I can post them. But it's interesting that it specifically mentions Turks, and the Khazars are Turkic. Now, again, we talked about in the last episode that the Babylonian Talmud wasn't fully compiled yet. It was still being written. But after this time period, around 5 to 600, the Babylonian Talmud's basically fully compiled, so it is in existence by this point. Now, the Khazars and all Turkic tribes are part of what's called the Tangri religion, which basically is Turkish for sky god. And so it's basically Turkic paganism. So initially, we can pull up the map here with the picture of the Caucasus Mountains. So you see the Khazars, and then you have the Caucasus, you have Georgia, you have Dagestan, Armenia, then what's now Turkey, and then beneath you have the various caliphates. Now, when Islam first rises with the Rashidun Caliphate, it's like Islam pops up, and then what seems like a couple years later, it owns half the world. So you see it goes all across North Africa, It goes up into France, where they end up fighting against Charles Martel and the Franks. This is early 700s, so about the same time. That's what all the history books talk about. They talk about what's going on in the West. Never do they talk about the Khazars. I didn't even hear about these guys until I was playing a game, actually, like years and years later. But in the East, they overwhelm the Persian Empire. They conquer what's now the entire Arab world. And then they go up through the Caucasus. And if it weren't for the Khazars, ironically, they could have very well gone up into Europe through what's now Ukraine and Eastern Europe, because it's pretty flat. But the Khazars were in the way. So this is when you have the Khazar-Arab Wars. Now, the Khazar-Arab Wars, this is before they convert to Judaism. This is, there's a city, Balanjar. There's 3 battles there, at least 3 battles. I think it's Alp Tarkhan and a few of these early Khazar rulers. Yeah, Barjik, Khazar Tarkhan. And ultimately, they're able to, it's basically a stalemate. Like, neither side overwhelms the other one. But they keep the Muslims from coming up into what's now Russia, essentially. Do you have any questions so far, by the way?
No, I'm tracking.
Okay, cool. Now, one other thing about these Arab caliphates is they're very short-lived. They expand very, very quickly, but they're short-lived. So the Rashidun Caliphate's in existence from 642 to 661. That's less than 20 years. Then you have the Umayyad Caliphate. These are the guys that basically overrun North Africa and eventually end up fighting the Franks in Western Europe. And they totally conquer Spain. If you remember, Spain was under Islamic occupation up until basically the 1300s. Like when Christopher Columbus came over, it was within about 100 years of freeing of when Spain became basically pushed out all the Christian, or the Muslims rather. So Umayyads last till 750, which is right after the Khazars convert to Judaism. We'll get into that in a second. After that, you have the Abbasid Revolution, which is in Baghdad. Baghdad at the time was one of the most populated, and if not the most populated city in the world. It was a hub of culture, art, literal crossroad of civilizations. And the Abbasids were different than the previous 2 caliphates because those were focused almost entirely on conquest. The Abbasids were more cultural. They were focused on the arts and spreading culture and discoveries. They were a lot more, you could say, civilized, for lack of a better term. Now, up in Khazaria, we have the first ruler who converts to Judaism, Bulan Sabriel. Now, there's various theories as to why the Khazars adopted Judaism. Do you have any guesses on why?
Well, I heard a story. I don't know if it's true, but the Rus told them that they had to choose Islam or they had to choose a main religion, Islam or Christianity, so they chose Judaism. I don't know if that's true or false.
Okay, I like that you brought that up, because the Rus didn't even become Christian until, well, on a large scale, until about 1000 AD under Saint Vladimir the Great. And a lot of people, I actually heard on this show not too long ago that the Tsar of Russia told them they had to convert to Christian or Islam, and I'm like, there was no Tsar of Russia until about 800 years later. So what happened basically was, and this is, we're not entirely sure the entire story. Like there's probably books written about it somewhere, but they're probably all in Russian or Armenian or something. But my understanding, based on my research, is that Bulan, he recognized that he was as one of the major powers in the world at the time. You had Khazaria, you had Eastern Romans, you had this was shortly before the Holy Roman Empire, but you had a lot of like you had the powers of Rome, like under the what's now the papacy, and then you had the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates in the south. There was no Persian Empire anymore, and yeah, so it's basically just those three really, and they didn't want to be pagan anymore, or at least Bulan didn't, because the pagan societies weren't very stable in comparison. So, what major religions do we have here? We have Christianity. Now, this is before the Great Schism, so there's Eastern Orthodox, Catholic. They're still in communion with each other. They're more just different traditions than actual different like religions. So you have Christianity, which is out of Constantinople, and Rome. And then you have Islam, which is out of Mecca, which obviously is the religion of the caliphates. He doesn't want to be subservient to either one. So he sends, and this is in the Khazar Correspondence, which I'll also get to. He sends like these scholars out, or I think what happens is he invites them to Khazaria. So he also gets a Talmudic scholar, a Jewish scholar, who basically tells him that these two religions, Christianity and Islam, they both came out of Judaism. And then he's like supposedly enlightened. And also it's convenient because if these people convert to Judaism, what does that enable them to do? What does that give them essentially license to do in comparison when dealing with Gentiles?
Anything they want.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and not just anything they want, like they're encouraged to do harm to other groups. So he converts to Judaism, and then his son, King Obadiah the First, he does a massive, essentially, you could say a Jewish renaissance. Like he invites Jewish scholars from all over the world, constructs synagogues all over the place, starts building these cities. And next thing you know, you have this Jewish empire, which it's not, I mean, it's semi-nomadic. Like you have, a lot of people might think of this place as like full of tents and like the Mongols. No, these were like full-on cities that you had here. Atil, Balanjar, Samandar, and later the fortress of Sarkil, which I'll get to later, which ends up being one of the most well-fortified fortresses in the world. It's a civilized like kingdom, and not only is it a massive empire. Well, look at this map here. You can see its extent. The darker part is the heart of Khazaria, and then outside of it's more of like its conquest as it gets lighter and lighter. Now, there was a city that was established in the 700s called Sambat. You'll see it on the map, but it's under a different name. This was a trading outpost that was captured early on by the early Rus. Any guesses on which city what the name of this city is now?
Kiev.
Yep,
Okay.
it's Kiev. So Kiev actually started out as a Khazar trading post.
Oh wow.
And so this is about the same time that they convert to Judaism. So there is a Jewish history of Kiev, and look at like who's running Kiev now. Like, I mean, it's crazy. And also like, not only did they start Kiev, but they also had like all these other cities that you can see on the map. That's what's now Ukraine. Like most of what's now Ukraine was once under Khazar rule. So we'll fast forward a little bit here.
Wait, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So are we talking about 740 being the year for the conversion?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay.
That general decade.
And it's safe to assume that the actual Jews living in the, Khazaria at that time were a very small minority, correct?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, because the thing with the Turks are they're not a Semitic people. They're actually very clearly Japhethite. So in the Khazar correspondence, which is a letter that was allegedly written, we're not like 100% sure, but uh, I mean there's not really anything that opposes it directly. So, and it's one of the few written documents that we have, but it actually talks about how the sons of Noah, you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem obviously is the father of, I mean, not just the Jews, but like the Arabs too, and a lot of the Semitic peoples. Japheth is the father of the very clearly non-Semitic, and one of the sons, uh, Togarma, had now we don't know for sure if this is true, like his exact sons, but according to this correspondence, it's one of them's Khazar, one of them or Khazar, one of them's Bulgar, one of them's um, Kartlos. Like these guys have um, uh, like they make it very clear in this letter that they're not Semitic and that they converted to Judaism. Now, here's another interesting thing. You know how in most Christian kingdoms, or like you have, say, the Franks, they were originally pagan, or the Teutonic peoples, they were pagan, but they converted to Christianity. Then their kings started adopting Christian names, right? Well, the Khazars had the same thing. They had the Turkic names like Bulan, but then as soon as they converted, they start having names like Jewish names. So King Obadiah, he's the one that invites the rabbis in and really adopts rabbinical Judaism. Then Hezekiah, Manasseh the first, Hanukkah, Isaac, Zebulun, Manasseh the second, Nisi, Aaron, Menahem, Benjamin, Aaron the second, Joseph, David, and George. So it's interesting because it's like the one example of a culture that actually takes, other than modern Israel, but that takes these Jewish names and applies them to their kings. We don't know a whole lot about most of them. Like, it's bizarre too, because it's almost like the record was erased. But people would have known a lot about these people because, I mean, if you look at that map, Khazaria was the largest empire in Europe at the time. Like at one point, like it was bigger than everywhere else, and it was very multicultural. The Khazars were like the ruling group of people, but it was a relatively small part of the population. It was like you had all sorts of Turkic tribes and everything. So the point that I'm making here also is not, there's a lot of people like the Ashkenazi Jews, and in the Bible, Ashkenaz is one of the sons of, I believe, Japheth. If not, he's one of the grandsons of Japheth. And in the Bible, he's used to refer to the Scythians. When it refers to the sons of Ashkenaz, he's talking about Scythians. These are people that inhabit this same general area. But the Ashkenazis, like these Khazars, after their conquest, they had to go somewhere. So it makes sense that the Ashkenazis are largely descendants. But the broader point is that even if they're not, so what? Like, it's not anymore that they ethnically have to be Jewish. It's that they follow the Talmud. And that's what medieval manuscripts talking about things that the Jews have done. They're not referring to your average Karaite, which is essentially a Jew that just follows the Torah, not the Talmud. They're referring specifically to followers of the Talmud when they refer to Jews. So yeah, what was that?
So whenever these people move on into history, this is another example, like the Himyar example, where they're not going to be ethnically Jewish.
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
There's not going to be much Jewish blood in there at all.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about how the Khazar economy worked. Now, what do you notice about the location? Like, how do you think they were able to generate most of their income just based on their location?
Trading? Because
Exactly.
pass through.
Trading and especially usury. They were at that perfect spot where they were a literal crossroads. They had the Muslims to the south, and the Muslims were huge into trade at this time too. Under the Abbasids, they were more concerned about trade and culture than about military conquest. The Eastern Roman Empire, which was right there, but they weren't adjacent to the Khazars. So while the Eastern Romans were Christians and the Khazars were Talmudic Jews, they didn't really come directly into conflict with each other. So they were more like natural allies, kind of like how in World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were they're allies because, I mean, from a purely geographical standpoint, they weren't like a direct threat to each other. They were allies out of convenience. Um, so they helped each other out. Now the Rus, which are probably the most important group for this video, other than the Khazars. These are early Proto-Slavs who'd mixed with Varangians, mostly Swedish Vikings, and the Rus at this time were still pagan. We're talking the 700s, 800s. And the way that you can think about the Rus is very similar to how you can think about the early Americans, the Americans being like the Rus and the British being like the Khazars. The Russia, or the Kievan Rus, was essentially a war of independence, not only from the Khazarian Empire, but from the Jews that were controlling it. So Russia and Ukraine's entire history, they were founded on essentially an uprising against these Talmudic Jews, which really puts things into perspective, like, and makes what's going on right now make a lot of sense, like especially with how much of a Jewish influence still is in Ukraine. But yeah, so it's mostly trading. You got China in the Far East, still under the Tang Dynasty, and the Khazars can have these massive usurious tariffs on anything and everything going through, and not just usury, but slavery. I mean, in the Talmud, it makes it very clear that basically nothing's off limits. So they constantly have these raids, especially against Christian populations, especially the Rus. The Slavs are their main target. So by the time that the Rus essentially rise up and take out the Khazars, it's not just because they're Jewish and the Rus want to be Christian, or they just want their independence. It's these people are constantly like raiding them and taking slaves, and I mean, and it's not just. I mean, the Muslims were doing the same sort of thing early on, especially, but I mean, there's a difference. Like, if you're dealing with people following the Talmud, taking you in as a slave, yeah, it's not going to be a good time. So yeah, they'd constantly be raiding these Slavic lands, also Georgia and Armenia. There's there's like writings that are, a lot of them are in, like, haven't really been translated into English, but I've heard about them, that like the Armenians and Georgians, like if you hear about even the Azeris, other Turkic groups, if you ask them about the Khazars, they're not going to give you some weird like, wait, the Khazars, who are they? I mean, they know. they know exactly who they were, for the most part. But yeah, so they'd have these slave trades. They hired a lot of different Turkic mercenary groups, and going up to 940 was Prince Sviatoslav. Now, Sviatoslav was okay. So the Russian dynasty, the way that, or the early Russians, so Kiev and Rus. So you had Rurik, who the dynasty was named after. He was a Viking, basically. Rurik, Oleg, Igor, and then Igor's wife was Saint Olga of Kiev. She was a little crazy, but long story short, she was one of the first to be baptized and become a Christian. And then her grandson, Saint Vladimir, was the person who officially adopted Christianity as the religion of the Rus, and that's why Russia's Eastern Orthodox today. And that was largely because of a military and cultural agreement that they had with the Eastern Romans for a mutually beneficial situation. Now, the son of Saint Olga was Prince Sviatoslav. Now, Sviatoslav was not a Christian. He was at least according to the tradition, he was a pagan. He was pretty brutal. He wasn't the greatest guy, you could say. He also, have you seen the pictures of the Cossacks, like where they have the mustache? They're basically bald, except they have like a little kind of ponytail thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what he looked like. So he was a pretty brutal. He was a pagan, but he fought these two wars that destroyed the two most important empires that were adjacent to the Rus. Now, the interesting thing is one of these empires I haven't mentioned yet, but they are a distant relation to the Khazars. They're both descended, at least partially, from the Turks. So these are the first Bulgarian Empire, which they were actually the first. Yeah, I forgot to mention that actually. But the Bulgarians were also Christian. This was in the 600s when they converted with Saint Cyril and Methodius. But they were Christian, but they were not friends of the Eastern Romans at all. They were rivals. And they also had a very Turkic type structure until Tsar, Simeon, converted. I think it was, yeah. But then it became a more like European style empire. But this guy smashed both the first Bulgarian Empire and the Khazarian Empire within like a 20-year period of each other. Now, when Sviatoslav went east across Khazaria, he sacked the major cities. He sacked Atil, which is the capital. It's on the Black Sea, or not the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. And Sarkel, which translates to White House in Turkish, was one of the most fortified fortresses in the entire world at the time that we know of. It was the Eastern Romans helped to construct it largely because of a marriage that they had. Leo the Khazar married, I forget who it was, but they had like a royal marriage. Another interesting note is that these Khazar rulers, it wasn't like a European system where you had the king and you had, dukes and these various other groups. This was a very unique system. You had the Khan or the Khagan, who was he was a figurehead, and it was like almost like a Jewish rabbi sort of role almost, and they basically were within the palace walls for their entire reign. And there's mixed sources that don't necessarily always agree on the same thing, but they were basically almost more like spiritual leaders, where the actual authority and power came from the Khan Bek, which was more like a military general. I also read that that all of the kings traditionally were supposed to rule for 40 years. I found it interesting. I don't know if it's true or not.
40 or 4?
40.
Okay.
Yeah, based on, like, I'm guessing the biblical tradition of David and Saul and Solomon. So,
I got a lot of questions.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Were any of these rulers of the Khazars, were any of them the original Jewish inhabitants? The Jewish minority is what I mean? Or were they still the Turkic people who were ruling themselves?
Oh, these guys were all Turkic.
Okay. So when you Google this, the conversion, you know, it comes up with a Wikipedia page. It's called like conspiracy theory that Khazar was converted to Judaism, right? But then if you go to what is it, Jewish Virtual Library, it says that clearly this is true. But so my question is, why is Wikipedia trying to say that this is a conspiracy theory? Is it because of the immorality of the Khazarian people and they don't want that put on Judaism? Is it because it dilutes their bloodline? Like, I'm trying to grasp this when you're talking. What's the angle?
So is which conspiracy theories are you talking about? Like how they're like
saying that them
Ashkenazi
converting to
Jews,
Judaism was a conspiracy theory on Wikipedia. But why, I'm asking, why is it, you know what I mean? Looking it up on Wikipedia, it makes it pretty clear. Like, no one's going to deny that they converted to Judaism. If you were to ask, I've seen articles and videos actually about, like, if they were to ask a Jew about Khazaria, either assuming that they're familiar with it, a lot of them are like, yeah, it was a glorious kingdom that was like, I mean, it's pretty easy to like say that, to paint Khazaria in a positive light. If you're trying to defend it, you could just say it was, because I mean, from a worldly perspective, it was very successful. It was a golden age for like Talmudic Judaism. So it would be easy to paint it in a positive light. But did their neighbors think of them as more immoral than others, or?
Oh yeah,
they did. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because there's this podcast that I listen to. It's called The Orthodox Nationalist. I'm not sure if the videos, some of them have been taken down, but the guy does it on multiple occasions. Says that, you know how there's the Gog and Magog in the Ezekiel 38 war, and how a lot of people try to relate them as like Russia and Turkey, and that there's going to be the final war where they all gang up on Israel and invade Israel. Turkey and Russia, like the Gog and Magog, like a lot of the Calvary Chapel and like evangelical denominations will say that there's going to be this final war where like Iran and Russia and all these countries gang up and attack Israel, and then God himself is going to intervene, stuff like that. Well, throughout the Middle Ages, they weren't, Gog and Magog, they weren't referring to obviously these countries that would come and attack Israel, because Israel didn't exist anymore. Except that it did, because according to the Khazar Correspondence, so the Khazar Correspondence, King Joseph, this is late 800s, I believe, that he's talking to this Jewish scholar in Spain, and this Jewish person in Spain he hears of this mythical kingdom called Khazaria, aka Israel, which they refer to themselves as the New Israel, and so he's like curious. He's asking him about the history and tradition, and I can get into that a little bit later. But anyway, these guys refer to themselves as Israel, much the same way as I mean, the Eastern Romans also referred to themselves as Israel, and Constantinople as the New Jerusalem. Like, this isn't a new thing at all. The idea of Israel being here. But where this ties in with Gog and Magog is that most Christians believed this is the synagogue of Satan. This is a giant like Talmudic Jewish Antichrist empire, like the Antichrist manifest as an empire, essentially. That's what Khazaria represents. So it wasn't like these were just pagan bandits who were attacking. This was an organized, completely anti-Christian in their beliefs empire that was essentially seen as Gog and Magog. And and it's interesting because now it's completely inverted, whereas our Talmudic Jewish entity, that's Israel, is the good guys, and then everyone that's coming to attack them, including Russia, are the Gog and Magog. So it's just interesting to see how that's like been flipped.
So when this guy 1920, I think you said 20 years, so 1940, like I'm sorry, 920 to 940. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And he sacked their cities. Was that the end of Khazaria, or did they live through that?
They lived through it. It was the end of the Khazarian Empire as like it was kind of like the collapse of the Soviet Union in a sense, except obviously this was militarily. So yeah, this was a mostly military sort of conquest. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't like it just disappeared overnight. They were still there.
Did they fraction into smaller countries or stay one big empire?
It was more like they were scattered, different tribes, and then they migrated to other places. A lot of them migrated into Eastern Europe because it's right there, and also throughout the Islamic world too.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
Sure.
When you're fast forward to World War II and you're in these towns in Poland and Ukraine, and like half of the people in the small town are Jewish, are these descendants of people who have left this Khazarian Empire, or no? Are these different people?
It'd make the most sense for them to be. It's really hard to trace exactly, but I mean, all these Jews definitely came from somewhere, and it wasn't from the Middle East.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at a Jew and then you look at a regular like Slav, I mean, they're both almost all white. Like in that area, it's really hard to tell the difference just by looking at them.
And it seems like the small difference that they do have to the other white people around them is the nose, which they could have got from Turkish mixing.
For sure.
Right.
And also the I heard this, I don't remember the exact names, but there were these 4 towns in what's now like Eastern Turkey called Ushkanaz, Ashkenaz, Ishkanaz, and Ushkanuz, something like that, but they all sound like Ashkenaz. And it sound like it's Turkic. The language, you know what language they spoke primarily?
No.
Yiddish, which a lot of people say is German, but it's actually a Turkic language. Like, it has a lot more in common with the Turkic languages. Not that I know Yiddish, but
interesting.
Yeah,
because Yiddish was the universal Jewish language before they revived Hebrew, but that was fairly recently.
Basically, yeah.
Right. Okay.
And then in modern Hebrew, I don't know how much it's based off Yiddish, but it's not exact, and also like it's based off the Khazar language. Oh yeah, you did bring up another point. Why are so many of them in Poland? Well, that we can get into in another episode because I'd like to go into that as well. Poland, what later became. Have you ever heard of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth?
No, I don't think so.
So this was an empire that lasted about 250, 290 years. It was a joint marriage. It started out a joint marriage between the king of Lithuania, or the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and the Queen of Poland. Jadwiga and Jogaila. And this was unique because it wasn't a traditional monarchy. This was essentially a elected monarch, constitutional monarchy. It was a republic that had a monarch. The monarch could be from anywhere, and it is basically, for people who say America was the first of its kind, like democratic and capitalistic and everything. Well, Poland was that exact sort of system, and it existed 250 plus years before the United States. And they were actually run by these oligarchic Kahal communities. And these Kahals were entirely Jewish. And they had tons of power, but almost no accountability. Like they literally followed different laws than your average Catholic, Pole, or Orthodox Ukrainian or Belarusian. So it was like a dual sort of system. We can get into that in another episode, but and that also ties in really closely with even what's going on in Ukraine right now. So the Khazars also, they tie into the later Turkish empires, because I mean, you can see there have been all these civilizations that have risen and fallen, but they're always like there's always Rome, there's always a Turkish empire, there's always a Persian empire. I mean, they go away for certain amounts of time, but they come back. So it's interesting because you have the after the Great Schism, there's the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire, and they're like Eastern Orthodox. Essentially, what happens is they transfer their lineage to the Rus through a marriage between Emperor Basil II, arguably the single most pivotal figure in the history of Europe, because he's the person that works with Saint Vladimir or Prince Vladimir to convert to Christianity. And that's why Russia's Eastern Orthodox today, because of that relationship and that conversion. Now, Russia, the Byzantines, they mostly collapse after the Crusaders sacked the city in 1204, and then they ultimately collapse to the Turks, the Ottomans, in 1453. Meanwhile, you have the Rus, who later they get conquered by the Mongols. This is a couple hundred years after the fall of Khazaria, but they or they don't get completely conquered. They get devastated, but then they sort of come back. 1380, the Battle of Kulikovo. That's when the Russian prince Dmitry Donskoy forms a confederation and fights against the Mongols and essentially gets independence. And that's where Russia as we know it today really, really starts. Now, it was a marriage between Basil II and his daughter to Saint Vladimir. That's where that marriage started. And so they basically passed the torch after the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire to the Ottomans of Eastern Orthodox Christianity to the Russians. So you might have heard of the Third Rome of Moscow being essentially the successors of Constantinople. So some people even consider Russia as the direct successor of Rome. Now, you still have, in that case, Rome, and you have the Turks. So after the Khazars fell, the Seljuks rose up. These were semi-nomadic, and these were the ones who were fighting mostly against the Crusaders. And then after that, the Ottomans rise up. But there's always a Turkish empire, and the Ottomans, in that sense, are the successors of the Khazars. They were Muslim, but there were a lot of Jewish influence. They had a lot of Jews living there. They treated Jews relatively well, especially when you compared them to Christians. Now, there's also... What was that?
Do you know the circumstances of the conversion? Like, so they were defeated, and then they were still with Judaism. Like, do you know about the conversion to Islam? Like, how did that take place?
Oh, that's a good question. So most of the Turks that were living further south, they were influenced a lot more because they didn't inhabit the same area. Khazaria was in what's now West Russia, South Russia, and Ukraine, whereas the Seljuks, they were like cousins. They weren't the same people, but they were like distant cousins. And same with the Ottomans. They weren't direct successors or anything, but they were the preeminent Turkish empire that was there.
Okay, so the part that I had said before seems invalid now, where I said the small minority and then the large majority converted, which is later Jews, because those are not later Jews. The large majority, because they end up converting to Islam. So it's just that the minority mixed with the Turks, but still only that minority after Khazaria was Jewish, correct?
Yeah, and this is also a very different group of people too. Okay, so one more thing, we're gonna get into the Khazar correspondence. Now, this is about 950, and I was incorrect. So I said before that the Sviatoslav, or I think, do you remember what year I said?
You said
Sviatoslav?
920, and it took about 20 years to defeat Khazaria.
Okay, so that's incorrect. It was actually like 964, and it was
Okay.
pretty swift. It wasn't like a prolonged campaign.
Okay.
Because Khazaria already had a lot of internal issues, especially when it came to trade, because they basically taxed a lot of the people to death already that were going through. So they kind of ran out of people to tax, and it was starting to more or less collapse in on itself anyway. But this is a correspondence between a person named Chazdai ibn Shaprut, who was a Jewish scholar and living in what was at the time Islamic Cordoba in Spain, and then Khan Yosef of the Khazars. Now, basically, Chazdai in Cordoba is he starts the letter by saying, "I, Chazdai, son of Isaac, son of Ezra, belonging to the exiled Jews of Jerusalem and Safarad, a servant of my lord the king, bowed to the earth to him and prostrate myself toward the abode of your majesty from a distant land. I rejoice in your tranquility and magnificence and stretch forth my hands to God in heaven that he may prolong your reign in Israel." Which is interesting because he refers to Khazaria as Israel.
Interesting.
I always ask, I'm going to skip a paragraph here. I always ask the ambassadors of these monarchs who bring gifts about our brethren, the Israelites, the remnant of the captivity, whether they have heard anything concerning the deliverance of those who have languished in bondage and have found no rest. It says in a subnote here, he was anxious to know if the 10 lost tribes existed as an independent Hebrew state anywhere.
Which they didn't, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I've heard a lot of theories on that, and I used to kind of be like, "Oh, this is interesting. What if this group of people actually is?" And then they got into stuff like, "Oh, the British Empire is really the descendants of Manasseh, and America is the descendants of Ephraim." It's like, no, that's no. I mean, how would you even prove that? But
yeah, because after the Assyrian captivity, they were never seen again. The 10 lost tribes.
Exactly, and most of them actually, most likely went actually to the west to Carthage, because the Phoenicians and the ancient Israelites were very closely tied in with each other. Okay, I'll just read this paragraph too. It says, "At length, mercantile emissaries of Khorasan," now this is in northern Iran at the time, or what's now northern Iran, told me that there's a kingdom of Judah which is called Al-Khazar. And remember, Judah isn't one of the 10 lost tribes. These are,
right,
I mean, the Jews. But I did not believe these words, for I thought that they told me such things to procure my goodwill and favor. I was therefore wondering till the ambassadors of Constantinople came between 944 and 949 with presents and a letter from their king to our king, and I interrogated them concerning this matter. they answered me, "It is quite true, and the name of that kingdom is Al-Khazar. It is a 15 days journey by sea from Constantinople, and but by land many nations intervene between us. The name of the king now reigning is Yosef. Ships sometimes come from their country to bring fish skins and wares of every kind. The men of our confederates and are honored by us. The men are our confederates and are honored by us. There is communication between us by emissaries and mutual gifts. They are very powerful. They maintain numerous armies, which they occasionally engage in expeditions. When I heard this report, I was encouraged. My hands were strengthened and my hope was confirmed. Thereupon I bowed down and adored the God of heaven." And it says in a subnote too, Hasdai was happy. Christians could no longer say the Jews were without a country as a punishment for their rejection of Jesus.
Wait, say that last part again? Sorry, do that last sentence again.
It says Christians could no longer say the Jews were without a country as a punishment for their rejection of Jesus.
Okay, great. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
because I'm getting ready to do this one on dispensationalism. Mm-hmm. And the point is that Christians nowadays who are Zionists say that, you know, they support Israel being in existence, but the Bible specifically says it's a conditional promise.
Exactly.
It's conditional upon repentance. And so you can only make that argument that, you know what I'm saying? That the Jews are okay in Khazaria if they're in a repentant state, which nobody would make that claim ever. Or in Israel today.
Exactly. Plus, I mean, there's nowhere in the Bible a lot of people go back and say, oh, this prophecy is referring clearly to Israel coming back in like as a country, but throughout the New Testament, it's really clear that whenever it's referring to Israel or God's Israel, it's referring to the church, not to some. And then after the destruction of the temple. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This is King Yosef's reply. Now, I'm going to do my best to abbreviate this because it is quite a bit longer than the last one. But it says at the top, the letter of Yosef the king, son of Aaron the king, the Turk, may his creator preserve him, to the head of the assembly, Hasdai, the son of Isaac, son of Ezra. I wish to inform you that your beautifully phrased letter was given by us, son of Eleazar, a Jew of the land of Germany. And it says here, Isaac carried, or his father, carried it through Germany, Hungary, and Kiev and Rus to Khazaria. You made us happy, and we are delighted with your understanding and wisdom. Let us therefore renew the diplomatic relations that once obtained between our fathers, and let us transmit heritage to our children. You ask us also in your epistle, of what people, of what family, and of what tribe are you? Know that we are descended from Japheth through his son Togarma. In Jewish literature, Togarma is the father of all the Turks. So that's what the Talmud would say. I have found in the genealogical books of my ancestors that Togarma had 10 sons. These are their names. The eldest was Ujur, the second Taurus, Avar. I'll just skip to where it says Kozar, and then also Bulgar. These are the mythical founders of tribes. This is a subnote. These are the mythical founders of tribes that once lived in the neighborhood of the Black and Caspian Seas. I am a descendant of Khazar, the seventh son. Now, I believe this is actually contrary to what's in the Bible, because I'll double check this, but from my understanding, the Bible says Togarma had 3 sons, but this is according to the Jewish literature. Let's see. I have a record that although our fathers were few in number, the Holy One, blessed be he, gave them strength, power, and might, so they're able to carry on war after war with many nations who were more powerful and more numerous than they. By the help of God, they drove them out and took possession of their country. Upon some of them, they have imposed forced labor even to this very day. Now, this is interesting because not only is this admitting that they're imposing forced labor, they're bragging about it, and they're saying that that's because of God's blessing. And this ties also back to in First Kings, where King Solomon, when he's building the temple, the first temple, he appoints a person, I forget his name, as the head of forced labor. Like it says pretty clearly in the Bible that Solomon used forced labor to build the temple as well. The land in which I now live was formerly occupied by the Bulgars. Our ancestors, the Khazars, came and fought with them, and among these Bulgars, although these Bulgars were as numerous as the sands on the shores of the sea, reference to the book of Joshua, they could not withstand the Khazars, so they left their country and fled while the Khazars pursued them as far as the Danube. Up to this very day, the Bulgars camp along the Danube and are close to Constantinople. And that's true because the Bulgars originally were a Turkic tribe, and they migrated into, well, what's now Bulgaria, and they're like kind of a mix of Turk and Slav historically. There was also a kingdom called Volga Bulgaria, which was up in a little bit north of Khazaria, and these are like cousins of the Khazars, basically. After this, several generations passed until a certain king arose whose name was Bulan. This is the one we talked about earlier. He was a wise and God-fearing man, trusting in his creator with all his heart. He expelled the wizards and idolaters from the land and took refuge in the shadows of the wings. After this, his fame was spread broadcast. The king of the Byzantines and the Arabs, who had sent him envoys and ambassadors with great riches and many great presents to the king, as well as some of their wise men with the objective of converting them to their own religion. But the king, may his soul be bound up in the bundle of life, a standard burial phrase for Jews, with the Lord his God being wise, sent for a learned Israelite. The king searched, inquired, investigated carefully, and brought the sages together that they might argue about their respective religions. One of them refuted, however, the arguments of his opponent, one of them refuted, however, the argument of his opponent, so that they could not agree. When the king saw this, he said to them, "Go home, but return to me on the third day." On the third day, he called all the sages together and said to them, "Speak and argue with one another and make clear to me which is the best religion." They began to dispute with one another without arriving at any results until the king said to the Christian priest, "What do you think of the religion of the Jews and the Muslims? Which is to be preferred?" The priest answered, "The religion of the Israelites is better than that of the Muslims." The king then asked the Qadi, the Muslim representative, "What do you say? Is the religion of the Israelites or is that of the Christians preferable?" The Qadi answered, "The religion of the Israelites is preferable." Upon this, the king said, "If this is so, you have both admitted from your own mouths that the religion of the Israelites is better. Wherefore, trusting in the mercies of God and the power of the Almighty, I choose the religion of Israel, that is the religion of Abraham. If that God is whom I trust, and in the shadow of whose wings I find refuge, will aid me, he will give me the blah, blah, blah. As for you all, go now to peace in your own land." Yeah, so that's basically the conversion, like, according to this, and it makes a lot of sense too. As far as that reason of why they converted.
It's almost like the Christian scholar and then the Islamic scholar didn't understand that Judaism was no longer at that point under the Talmudic rabbis. It was no longer the Abraham of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And if they had understood that, the answer would have been opposite for both of them.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Islam is closer to Christianity than either is to Judaism under Talmudic rabbis.
Way closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if Christianity's like this, Islam's like this, and Judaism is polar opposite.
Right, right.
So going through the rest of this correspondence, it mostly gets into the history, basically what I talked about already, and then it talks about the relation of the Bible and the Talmud, and it talks about it even. Wait, hang on a second. There's one more paragraph that I think,
Okay.
yeah, would be really good.
Okay.
So, okay. So I'm gonna skip a couple paragraphs, but you can read the rest in the description. We'll post it. This is just on Wikipedia, so it's not hidden or anything. This one here says, now King Bolan, remember, he converted to Judaism, but it was Obadiah, his son, who made it the Talmudic religion. So it's likely Bolan genuinely wanted to have the best religion, but didn't really understand what he was getting into. So it says here, after the days of Bolan, there arose one of his descendants, a king Obadiah by name. The name means God's servant, who reorganized the kingdom and established the Jewish religion properly and correctly. He built synagogues and yeshivot, brought in Jewish scholars and rewarded them with gold and silver. And subnote, the Jewish scholars could have come from Baghdad and Constantinople. They explained to him the Bible, Mishnah, Talmud, and the order of divine services. The king was a man who revered and loved the Torah. He was one of the true servants of God. May the divine spirit give him rest. And then after that, it goes into more of the kings and more like kind of a lineage, and then talks about a couple of the cities. But like I said, we'll post the link in the description. You can read it. So in conclusion, we talked about Khazaria. A lot of people know about Khazaria, or they talk about the Khazarian mafia, but they don't really know the details. And so it's a very intricate history that we really don't know a ton about. And I'd like to do some episodes in the future as well, kind of digging more into different topics of this ancient kingdom. Ukraine, Russia today have a lot in common, or have a lot of deep history with Talmudic Judaism and the idea of there being a kingdom of Israel that's physically on the earth. And Khazaria, like I said, this predates the Christianity in the Slavic countries. This goes way, way back. And moving into the future too, we'll talk about Poland and kind of how ultimately this culminates with the Soviet Union. There's connections there too, with like how the Soviet Union's founded, and it's the same area. And a lot of the people, like the majority of people who founded the Soviet Union were Jewish. Lenin was a Chuvash, and the Chuvash were actually another Turkic ethnic group that's closely related with the ancient Khazars. And also, just one more tidbit of information. In Turkic-speaking countries, so Turkey, Azerbaijan, other ones, the Caspian Sea is actually referred to as the Khazar Sea.
Oh wow!
It still exists. So yeah, and we'll also do an episode on specifically New Khazaria and how what's going on in Ukraine, Greater Israel, possibly some other countries, how this whole history can feed into like a sort of resurrection of an ancient empire, much the same way that like Mussolini tried to recreate the Roman Empire. So yeah, do you have any questions, Jack?
No, you covered everything that I was interested in.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so a week from today, we should have, a week from when this is published, we should have the third and last episode in this series, which will be about Beta Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which will be another early Jewish kingdom. And that's what we got for you. Hope to see you then.